Today we bring to you a panel discussion on Commonwealth literature. We have a very distinguished set of panelists here with us, and I'll introduce them to you first before we actually start the discussion. To my immediate left is Lakshmi Kannan. Lakshmi Kannan is a bilingual writer who writes in English and in Tamil. Her pen name is Kaveri, and she has published several books of fiction, poems, and translation. She is presently a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies at Shimla. Next to her is Stephen Moss, literary editor of The Guardian. He was a judge of the 1997 Whitbread Best Novel Prize and the 1997 Commonwealth Writers' Prize. As well as writing on books, he also writes on music for The Guardian. Another judge for the 1997 Commonwealth Writers' Prize with us here today is Professor Malashri Lal to my immediate right. Malashri Lal is a professor of English at the University of Delhi, and her special area of interest is women's writing in cross-cultural perspectives. Her many publications include her book, The Law of the Threshold, Women Writers in Indian English. And next to her is Dr. Shamla Narayan, who has published books and articles on a wide variety of Indian writers in English. From 1972, she has been regularly compiling the Indian section of the annual bibliography, which appears in the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. At present, she is reader in English at Jamia Millia Islamia University. She has also been a judge of the Commonwealth Literary Prize in previous years, as has Lakshmi Kannan and also myself. So I think basically there's a kind of past and present panel of the Commonwealth Literary Prize judges sitting here. And we are going to discuss what Commonwealth literature is, what its status is today, how do we define this category, and the issue of language. Commonwealth literature was first instituted as part of the university curriculum at Leeds, England in the 1960s. In the 1970s, it came into India, not centrally, but peripherally as an optional at the master's level. It included African writing, Sri Lankan writing, Australian, Canadian literature, as well as Indian writing in English, etc. Broadly, Commonwealth literature was a collection of national literatures with some relationship to the British Commonwealth, a shared political history, and shared traditions such as in institutions of education, law, and so on, but above all, a shared language, because mostly Commonwealth literature is seen as written in English. But is Commonwealth literature simply literature written in English? Or would you sort of define the category in some other way? Now, I address this question to our panelists. Perhaps, Stephen, you would like to answer this question?
I think the term itself, as you said, it began in the 60s. It feels like a rather 60s term, a notion of let's do something for writers outside Britain. So I think the term may have somewhat outlived its usefulness in the 90s, where I feel such terminology has slightly broken down. I feel it's a somewhat outmoded term. It's a geographical entity. We're looking at writers within a given geographical area. That, for me, is the only criterion.
Actually, Benita Parry has also attacked this term as being somewhat outmoded in a 1987 Oxford Literary Review essay. And she says that it's very Europeanized. And it's a kind of characteristic product of disguised incorporation. You know, you're trying to incorporate it into...
Yes, I feel in the 60s when it began, no doubt one had a powerful British literature and a set of people thinking, well, let's try to find some people outside Britain who are writing well. Well, in a sense now, we know that plenty of people outside Britain write very well. They don't need to be labelled anymore as Commonwealth writers. They're just all writers operating within something called the British Commonwealth. It's a convenient label, but whether it's a useful label, I'm not so sure.
But I think, the alternatives are not any more successful. I mean, they've tried terms like new literatures in English or post-colonial literature.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to India. I mean, Indian writing in English.
Post-colonial literature would be worse, I think. Post-colonial literature would be worse.
Yes,
it would imply a given set of themes.
Yes.
I think there should be no imposition of themes.
I mean, post-colonial literature just doesn't apply to
no.
Indian literature in English, or even, new literatures. I mean, for something which has been going on for at least 150 years.
But wouldn't you think new literatures is a kind of fairly neutral term in terms of if we want to avoid all this kind of political underpinning of these particular terms, like even Commonwealth, post-colonial?
Actually, like Shamala, I also find the term Commonwealth quite acceptable, so long as one remembers that it's a useful historical category. Because it seems to me new literatures in English is an even worse term, even more politically loaded, because we are underscoring the word new, whereas these nations are many of them very old. So the link that they have is indeed something which is locked in time, because they were part of a certain hegemonic order. And so long as we see it as literature written in English, because English came to these nations in a certain context, I think we are all right.
Because new literatures, it seems to me, would then sort of, because English is relatively new, then would it mean extending the connotation of the term to include literatures written in our own languages, because that's where the old and the ancient would come in, and the aspect of civilization. Would you say anything to that,
That's
Lakshmi?
right, because you see, I think the time has come for us to distinguish the terms and stretch the term a little bit. If you can't make it inclusive of the vigorous, alive traditions, writing traditions in our vernacular, at least I think one should distinguish, for the sake of classification, as Commonwealth writing in English, Commonwealth writing in the vernacular, because we are very much a part of the Commonwealth. If it's the spirit of the times that we are alluding to, or that we are looking for, then it's very much there in the contemporary modern writing in Bangla or Kannada, Marathi, Telugu, wherever, Tamil. So I don't see how it couldn't be made inclusive, but then I think that is the inadequacy of the term.
No, but I think the very term was sort of coined to find a label for these literatures written in English by all kinds of people, by Indians or Canadians or Africans or whatever. So I feel, that the term itself implies that they're not talking about national literatures.
I would agree. It almost gives the opportunity to discuss transnational writers. For instance, where does one put Rohinton Mistry? As a Canadian or as an Indian? It would be difficult. But we can call him a Commonwealth writer and get away with it. The same for Michael Ondaatje. And at one time that would have been true of Bharti Mukherjee too.
But why do we need to call him a Commonwealth writer? Why can't we just call him a writer? What's the value of labelling him a Commonwealth writer?
Perhaps I'm thinking in terms of the matter that Asha raised a little while earlier. In what forms has the language of the Commonwealth evolved? What kinds of English are now being introduced into the creative work of writers from various countries?
No, that question of creativity is one, but the other thing which I want to pick up on from what you said, isn't it the kind of writing about leaving one's home? People like Rohinton Mistry, Salman Rushdie, Naipaul, people who've left their homes, this kind of, constant movement which is going on. Would Commonwealth writing encapsulate the spirit of that, the term itself or the literature? Would it sort of bring all these people together? And then we'll come to Stephen's second question, that do we need the term at all?
Well, it seems to me it does provide a common ground, because even if they're moving from one state of living to another, calling it imaginary homelands as Salman Rushdie does, there is still a commonality of the background from which they come. And quite often when they think in terms of being at home or leaving home, or there's a continuous back and forth really, as is happening with people like Vikram Seth, for instance, or Ardashir Vakil, they partly live abroad and partly in India, and they feel they belong to both places. And quite often they choose these two homes or alternative homes within the Commonwealth countries.
But here again, there seems to be a fetishization of this leaving of the home. and this, exile that they term it as, because it's not necessarily exile for people like Salman Rushdie, who've actually voluntarily gone to live in a place they feel best and most comfortable in. So, I mean, how far does one carry that particular thing? Because on the one hand, it's quite possible that people like Naipaul had to go to where they went because of historical reasons. But others who voluntarily go, I mean, why can't they just stay at home and write there? I mean, if they're so unhappy wherever they're writing from. So that...
It would also rule out virtually all British writers on the whole don't up sticks and move. And so we're thinking of British writers here as part of Commonwealth writing.
No, and you could always use the term, diasporic writers for people like Rushdie and Rohinton Mistry and so on.
So
and talking about British writers, from the beginning there's always this tendency to, Commonwealth literature is English language literature, leaving out Britain and USA. So I mean, this very term itself, I feel there's no room in it for national literatures. So
but then what we are saying is that Commonwealth literature leaves out British and American literature, but it doesn't leave out Australian, Canadian people who speak English in the first place, because it has a kind of inevitable link with Britain in some way or the other.
I wouldn't leave out British literature. I think it's very much a part of the Commonwealth writing segment if we are looking at it. But yes, I see Stephen's point that these are not writers who are leaving home, but there is a common concern, there is a common history that the British writers share with other writers from countries that used to be part of the British imperial context.
And like somebody said yesterday, that is a kind of melting pot, this whole category of Commonwealth literature, with all kinds of cultures and races as part of it. So would that that would bring British literature very much into this Commonwealth? So would you like to say something about British literature?
I would like to pursue the point of the value of the label, if for a little while if I could, because what do we feel is actually the value of the label Commonwealth writing? Is it a convenient way of organizing a prize around Commonwealth writing, or do we feel it has there seems to be a suggestion here that it's a way of almost propping up something valuable that we call the Commonwealth. But I presume that writers on the whole don't see themselves as a Commonwealth writer. They see themselves as a writer, which is why I feel that ruling out people writing the vernacular is very dangerous, to say that a Commonwealth writer can only write in English. I'm actually from Wales, and there are people in Wales who choose to write in Welsh and who then get translated into English. No, I don't see why one has to make that distinction.
But some of it is just the necessities of institutional and disciplinary.
But my fear is that we're looking here at as a sort of institutional apparatchik type system of where the whole system of judging the writing sort of gets in the way of the writing, as it were. I mean, the writing comes first. These people are writers writing within something called the British Commonwealth, and in a sense, it's the writing that matters, and it's just a geographical location or set of geographical locations called the Commonwealth, in which people are active.
I think the term is useful not so much for prizes, but to organize courses of study in academia, because I mean these writers have a lot in common. I mean, especially of the Black Commonwealth. I mean, if you're going to study the sort of literature from Africa or Caribbean literature.
Yes. So they would all, many would have post-colonial concerns.
So this Commonwealth literature provides a convenient term, for
so in a sense there you would have
to structure courses.
So you would have to separate, because I feel many British writers clearly would not share these concerns.
Yes.
It would be much more fragmented.
You'll find that in the usual courses we have on Commonwealth literature, the British literatures, I mean the mainstream writers are left out.
But actually I think the Commonwealth literature came in as a kind of, you see, in India, because earlier we just had British literature, and against that they sort of set up American literature, and then we had Commonwealth literature. And now with the increasing confidence and the body of literatures and knowledge about these literatures, we are actually having specialized courses on Australian literature,
Yes,
on Canadian literature, and with that, I think this sort of, umbrella term of Commonwealth literature will sort of, gradually wither away.
Yes, I mean, your notion of exile, Naipaul, Rushdie, I think that is a very neat encapsulation of a certain, but I don't think that would apply at all to some of the Canadians, Atwood and Carol Shields, who are actually very North American in their sensibility. And somebody like Carol Shields and, say, the American James Smiley would fit very neatly together. Carol Shields would be way outside this notion of the homeland of writers in exile. It would be very unhelpful. I think it's quite unhelpful in some ways to see Carol Shields as a Commonwealth writer. I think she is very much a mainstream North American writer.
So I think it's very difficult to sort of slot people under these kind of broad categories, but
she is a very fine writer who's writing within the Commonwealth, but I would not say she was easily classifiable as a Commonwealth writer.
Yes, I see the point. And maybe when we talk in detail about the writing from different countries, this is something we will address again.
But since we are talking about Canadian literature, why don't you sort of tell us
well,
a bit
again,
about
within Canada, there are lots of problems even beyond the term Commonwealth writing. For instance, there are at least 3 kinds of writing which have now shown up in Canada, and each one contending for space in literary curriculum. One is, as Stephen just mentioned, writers who are sort of mainstream, more North American, and these generally tend to be the white writers, Carol Shields, Robert Croach, Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Atwood, writers of this kind, who are talking in a way about the problem of what is it to be a Canadian. They are addressing that question. There's another group that is the Canadian Indian writers, of people like Jeanette Armstrong, or the spokesperson Emma LaRocque, who talks about how difficult it is to be a Métis writer when you don't belong to either category. And then there are the South Asian Canadians, I mean, even more hyphenated as we come along the line. And Uma Parmeshwaran was recently in India, and she talked at length about the large body of writing that has now emerged in Canada, which calls itself SAC Lit, and is talking in terms of the problems of assimilation, or in fact resisting assimilation, as one of the issues that is addressed time and time again. So within Canada, the 3 groups really don't share common ground. So it's not just the term Commonwealth, but even within one country we see these separatist things happening.
So immigrant writing, I mean, what about immigrant writing, since you talked about immigrant writing in Britain? What is the status now? Because they say that the best fiction is coming from elsewhere. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I wouldn't call it immigrant writing. What one has seen, certainly in the last 10 years, is the prizes on the whole have been won by Canadians, by Peter Carey, an Australian, and by many of your fine Indian writers. But I don't see them as Indian writers. I see them as writers who, as you said, very happily make their home in India, America. They're writers who very easily commute on almost a global basis. In terms of British writing, it's also, like Canada, it's very fragmented, really. You have an old guard, not using that in a loaded way, people like Beryl Bainbridge, Faye Weldon, Anita Bruckner, Antonia Byatt, who go on producing very good novels every regular intervals. You have a group of the sort of young guns of about 15 years ago, Martin Amis, Julian Barnes, William Boyd, Ian McEwan, who are very well established. Quite hard for new people to break in, I think. There's an inbuilt tendency for those people to dominate the literary agenda. But there's a very strong Scottish tradition. James Kelman, a Booker Prize winner, Alistair Gray, some new Scottish writers, Irvine Welsh, Alan Warner, A.L. Kennedy. That's very active. There's a very strong Irish tradition. John Banville, William Trevor, Bernard McClaverty. I would not say there's any, it's a very fragmented scene, I think.
We've had a very interesting discussion on Commonwealth literature, the question of language, and we've touched very briefly upon British literature, writing in the regional languages in India, Indian writing in English, and Canadian literature. Now let me thank our very distinguished panelists for being here with us today and sharing their views with you. Thanks.